The birthday party. http://www.gradesaver.com/thebirthdayparty/study guide/short summary/ about the birthday party. Harold Pinter was working as an actor in England when he stayed briefly at a dilapidated boarding house that would serve as his inspiration for both the birthday party and The Room. As he has explained in many published works, he wrote more from intuition than from intellect, exploring his characters without predecided narratives in mind, and this one encounter was inspirational not because of people he met there, but because of a certain visceral feeling it gave him. Pinter wrote The Birthday Party in 1957, after his one-act play The Room attracted the attention of Michael Codron, a producer who saw much promise in the quirky playwright. The Birthday Party is Pinter's first full-length play, and the first of 3 plays considered his comedy of menace pieces. The other 2 are The Caretaker and The Homecoming. Comedy of menace, a term coined by critic Irving Wardle, describes a play which paints a realistic picture while creating a subtext of intrigue and confusion, as if the playwright were employing a sleight of hand trick. Pinter once said, "What I write has no obligation to anything other than to itself," which both belies the designation Wardle gave his plays, and acknowledges the originality that inspired such a designation in the first place. Inspired by other unconventional playwrights such as Samuel Beckett, Pinter transcended traditional theatre by staging a familiar setting, the English home, and then throwing it into a state of confusion with lies, deceit, and chaos. These juxtapositions would be further explored by Martin Esselin in his seminal study Theatre of the Absurd. The Birthday Party premiered in Cambridge's Arts Theatre on April 28, 1958, with Willoughby Gray as Petey and Richard Pearson as Stanley. Pinter directed the initial productions himself, but Peterwood took his place as director once the play hit the pre-London stage. Though the play was received well in Cambridge, it was a resounding failure during its run at the Lyric Opera House in Hammersmith. The avant-garde writing and the confusing subtext sat poorly with critics and audiences alike. Despite its initial commercial failure, The Birthday Party has since proven to be one of Pinter's most reproduced plays. It was revived by the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Aldwych Theatre in London in 1964, to critical success. Pinter directed this rendition of the show and later wrote, directed, and appeared in subsequent productions, including the 1968 filmed version which starred Robert Shaw as Stanley. The Lyric Opera House celebrated the play's 50th anniversary in May 2008, just months before Pinter's death. Theatre of the Absurd. An introduction. Martin Esselin, a theatre critic, coined the term Theatre of the Absurd to describe a number of works being produced in the late 1950s and early 1960s that defied any traditional genres. The most famous playwrights associated with this movement include Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, Jean Genet, and of course, Harold Pinter. The term absurd was originally used by Albert Camus in his 1942 essay, Myth of Sisyphus, wherein he described the human condition as meaningless and absurd. The key element to an absurdist play is that the main characters are out of sync with the world around them. There is no discernible reasoning behind their strangeness, though a threatening sense of change shakes their existence to the core. Influences on the absurdist theatre go as far back as the Elizabethan tragicomedies of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. The tragic plays Macbeth and Hamlet offer segments of comedy that shift the play's perspective, if only for the briefest moments. For example, Hamlet's wit and the porter scene in Macbeth offer moments of comedy to alleviate the drama's intensity. Other influences on the absurdist playwrights include the work of Sigmund Freud, and the Stylist movement of the 1920s and 1930s, which introduced the avant-garde to mainstream media. However, the largest influence was World War II and its aftermath. Like Pinter, who was a child during the war, many Englishmen and women felt disillusioned once the war was over. They were angry and upset with the world, but found it difficult to express their collective opinions. In such a damaged world, it was no longer feasible to use traditional methods of storytelling on stage. The human condition was too complex and fragmented, and the old forms of language were hence inappropriate for exploring it. To shake audiences from their more conventional viewing habits, The playwrights of the absurdist theatre used traditional settings to ease the audience into their plays, and then shocked them with surreal imagery, uncommon circumstances, or fragmented language. Language within the absurdist theatre often transcended its base meaning. As in The Birthday Party, nothing is as it seems and no one speaks the whole truth. Also, the use of silence as language was often utilized in these plays. The drama of the absurdist theatre is dreamlike, almost lyrical. Like the stylists before them, the absurdist playwrights use imagery, subtext, mythology, and allegory to express a deeper meaning which is often never fully explained. In fact, the playwrights of the theatre of the absurd allowed their plays to speak for themselves. Painter explained this absurdist concept best in his 1962 speech, Writing for the Theatre, which was presented at the National Student Drama Festival in Bristol. He said, "I suggest there can be no hard distinctions between what is real and what is unreal, nor between what is true and what is false. The thin line between truth and lies is perhaps the defining characteristic of the theatre of the absurd." Character list. P.T. P.T. Bowles is the owner of the rundown boarding house in which the play takes place. He is 60 years old and married to Meg. P.T. works a decade attendant at an unspecified seaside resort near his home on the shores of England. As the play continues, P.T.'s character is revealed to be more astute. He realizes that Goldberg and McCann are more insidious than they seem, and probably knows of his wife and Stanley's strange relationship. While P.T. seems to know quite a lot more than he lets on, he ultimately reveals that he will do little to compromise the comfortable, delusional existence he shares with Meg. Meg Bowles is a kind woman who helps run the boarding house. She is 60 years old and married to P.T. in a seemingly childless marriage. Absent-minded and simplistic, Meg often asks repetitive questions and constantly requires attention. While she does carry on a sexually tinged relationship with Stanley, Meg lives a rather humdrum life that allows her to maintain certain delusions about her attractiveness and popularity, delusions which she works hard to protect even as the play goes to darker places. Goldberg. Nat Goldberg, also called Sammy and Benny, is a Jewish gentleman who works for an unnamed organization that has employed him to take Stanley away from the boarding house. He is defined by his outwardly polite and suave demeanor, which stands in stark contrast to that of his associate McCann. However, he ultimately reveals an angry, violent streak beneath this suave demeanor. Goldberg's problems seem to be connected to his past. He is nostalgic about family, and waxes poetic about the old days. To what extent these delusions explain or feed his anger and violence are left to the reader's imagination. McCann. Dermot McCann is an Irish member of an unnamed organization that has hired him to take Stanley away from the boarding house. Unlike Goldberg, who uses words and charm to his advantage, McCann is a paragon of bodily aggression. He lacks much social skill, and is something of a simpleton. Lulu. A young woman in her 20s, Lulu is an acquaintance of Meg's and a visitor to the boarding house. She is childish and flirtatious, and though she seems initially interested in Stanley, she is easily attracted to Goldberg's charms. Her girlish qualities become ironically unsettling after she is sexually assaulted. Stanley. Stanley Weber is ostensibly the protagonist of the play. He is the only boarder at the Blouse boarding house, and is initially defined by laziness, unkemptness, and smug cruelty towards Meg. The many details of his past are never confirmed. He might be a musician, might have been famous, etc., although there is a sense that he has since unatoned for. His aggressive depression transitions into a nervous breakdown when Goldberg and McCann arrive, until he is nothing but a bumbling idiot in Act the Third. Glossary of terms. Boarding house. A private home where tenants live in exchange for payment. Booze up. British slang for a drinking party. Bracing. Invigorating. Cornflakes. A popular breakfast cereal made from corn. Fred bread. A core component of a traditional English breakfast, the equivalent of French toast hatch. An opening in a wall which connects the kitchen with the living room or dining area, so that people can speak between rooms. Headland. A thin strip of land which juts into the sea or another body of water. Lechery. Uncontained indulgence of lust. Mazel tov. Jewish term for congratulations or best wishes of Herr Konk. British slang meaning out of her mind. Rock cake. Traditional English fruit cake shaped like a biscuit round the bend. British slang for going insane. Sanatorium. A hospital for the treatment of chronic illness such as tuberculosis. Sellotape. A transparent adhesive similar to Scotch tape. Succulent. Having a delicious taste or quality. Ta-ta. British slang for goodbye. Taking the Michael. British slang for teasing. Also called taking the mickey. Torch. British parlance for a flashlight. Twopence. 2 pence. Washout. A failure. A brief summary of the birthday party. Act I. The play begins in the living room of a seaside boarding house in 1950s England. Petey, the boarding house owner, and his wife Meg, both in their 60s, sit at the living room table and engage in tepid conversation while eating breakfast. Meg is an inquisitive character who peppers Petey with repeated questions concerning his food, his job, etc. Petey informs his wife that 2 gentlemen will soon arrive to stay at the boarding house. He met them the night before. Meg is flustered by the news at first, but quickly recovers to promise she will have a room ready for them. She then calls out to Stanley Webber, their boarder who is asleep upstairs. When he doesn't answer, she goes upstairs to fetch him, and then returns a bit dishevelled but amused. Stanley, a bespectacled, unkempt, surly man in his 30s, soon follows. Petey and Stanley speak of mundane topics while Meg prepares cornflakes and fried bread for Stanley's breakfast. After Petey leaves for work, the atmosphere changes. Meg flirts with Stanley, who jokingly calls her succulent while criticising her housework. When Meg becomes affectionate, he rudely pushes her away and insults her. Meg then informs him that 2 gentlemen are coming. The news unsettles Stanley, who has been the only boarder for years. He accuses Meg of lying, but she insists that she speaks the truth. Before Meg leaves to shop, Lulu, a young girl in her 20s, arrives with a package. Meg instructs Lulu to keep the package from Stanley, and then she leaves. Lulu and Stanley chat for a little while, mostly about Stanley's lack of enthusiasm and his appearance. Lulu calls him a washout and then quickly exits. Stanley washes his face in the kitchen, and then leaves by the kitchen door. In the meantime, Goldberg and McCann enter the living room. They are the 2 gentlemen who had requested rooms for the evening. It becomes immediately apparent that Goldberg and McCann have come under mysterious circumstances to finish a job. The job in question seems to be Stanley, though details are scarce. Goldberg reassures McCann that they are at the right house, and that this job will cause no more stress than their jobs usually cause them. Goldberg rambles on about his uncle until Meg arrives, and introductions are made. Goldberg's sweet temperament and suave demeanour soon set Meg at ease. Goldberg asks after Stanley, and Meg tells him that Stanley was once a successful pianist but had to give it up. Meg also reveals that it is Stanley's birthday, and Goldberg suggests they have a party. Thrilled with the idea, Meg shows the gentlemen to their room. Later, Stanley returns to the living room as Meg arrives to put the groceries away. She tells him about the 2 gentlemen, and Stanley is visibly upset to learn Goldberg's name. To cheer him up, Meg suggests he open his birthday present, even though Stanley insists that it is not his birthday. To humour Meg, he opens the package and finds a toy drum with drumsticks. He hangs the drum around his neck and parades around the table beating the drum merrily until his rhythm becomes erratic and chaotic. He beats the drum possessively and looms over Meg with a crazed expression on his face. Act the second. Later that same evening, McCann sits at the living room table shredding a newspaper into 5 equal strips. Stanley arrives, and the 2 men awkwardly greet one another. McCann, in a calm tone of voice, congratulates Stanley on his birthday, and says it is an honour to be invited to his party. Stanley replies that he wants to spend the evening alone and tries to leave, but McCann will not let him. Stanley sits at the table and touches one of the newspaper strips, which upsets McCann. Stanley speaks of his past, and suggests he has never been one to cause trouble. Stanley insists that he has met McCann before, and grows upset when McCann denies the connection. Stanley wants to know why he and Goldberg are at the boarding house, and grows frantic when McCann claims they are there on a short holiday. Desperate, Stanley grabs McCann's arm, who violently hits him off. Shocked into submission, Stanley calms himself and speaks of his love for Ireland, for its people, its sunsets, and its police. He asks McCann to accompany him to a nearby pub, but is interrupted when Petey and Goldberg enter the room. Petey introduces Stanley to Goldberg, and then leaves. The situation in the room grows tense, as Goldberg yammers on about his past. Despite Goldberg's soothing words, Stanley remains on edge and refuses to sit down when McCann asks him to. It is not McCann's threats that convince him to sit, but rather Goldberg's quiet insistence. After Stanley submits, Goldberg and McCann interrogate him about his past. They accuse him of betraying their organization, of killing his wife, of leaving his bride at the altar, of being a waste of space, and more. Stanley answers at first, but is soon struck dumb by the sheer number of questions being thrown at him. The questions grow progressively more ridiculous and nonsensical. Finally, Stanley hits Goldberg in the stomach. McCann and Stanley threaten each other with chairs, but are cut back into civility when Meg arrives, beating Stanley's toy drum. She is dressed for his birthday party. Goldberg compliments her, and the tense atmosphere quickly dissipates as Meg makes a moving tribute to Stanley in a toast while McCann flashes a torch in Stanley's face like a spotlight. Lulu arrives, and Goldberg gives a second toast which includes more reminiscing. The party begins in earnest. Lulu and Goldberg flirt, while Meg and McCann speak of Ireland. Stanley sits alone at the table until Meg suggests they all play blindman's buff. During Stanley's turn, he is blindfolded by McCann, who breaks his glasses and puts the toy drum in his path so that Stanley's foot smashes through it. When Stanley reaches Meg, he begins to strangle her. Goldberg and McCann pull him off, but then the lights suddenly go out. In the darkness, the two gentlemen cannot find Lulu, who has screamed and fainted. McCann shines his flashlight on the table to discover Stanley standing over Lulu as though about to sexually assault her. He giggles manically as the men slowly approach him and the curtain closes. Act the third. The next morning, Petey sits at the living room table reading a newspaper, while Meg frets about having no breakfast food left. Her memory is hazy from the night before, and she forgets that Petey was not there as she tries to remember what happened. When she leaves to shop, she sees Goldberg's car in the driveway, and grows frightened. Petey calms her down. As Meg prepares to leave again, Goldberg enters the room and sits at the table. Meg asks him about the car, but he ignores her. She finally leaves. Petey asks Goldberg about Stanley, and Goldberg explains that Stanley suffered a nervous breakdown and needs to be taken to a doctor whom Goldberg knows. Petey wants to see Stanley when he wakes, despite Goldberg's insistence that he should simply leave for work. McCann enters with 2 suitcases, and tells Goldberg that Stanley is trying to fit his broken glasses into his eyes. When Petey suggests a way to fix the glasses and offers to fetch a doctor, Goldberg dismisses him. Petey departs to tend to his peas, insisting he be told when Stanley wakes, and Goldberg sits slumped over the table. McCann demands they expedite the job, but Goldberg ignores him. Angry, McCann shakes Goldberg's chair and calls him Sammy, which causes the latter to attack him. McCann pacifies Goldberg, who then admits he feels poorly and is confused by the feeling. He tells McCann about his father and about his own principles on family, and finally makes a strange request by asking McCann to blow into his mouth twice. McCann does so without question, and Goldberg is calmed. Lulu enters, and McCann leaves them alone. Lulu accuses Goldberg of having taken sexual advantage of her the night before. They argue over blame until McCann re-enters and tells Lulu to confess her sins. Startled by this bizarre turn of events, Lulu flees. McCann then leaves to fetch Stanley, who enters cleanly shaven and nicely dressed. The 2 men seem to take pity on Stanley, and Goldberg promises to buy him new glasses. In a reprise of the interrogation from Act the Second, they pepper Stanley with gentler questions and comments. Goldberg asks Stanley if he wants to leave with him, but Stanley can only muster gurgling sounds. They begin to exit with Stanley, but Petey arrives and tells them to stop. Menacingly, they ask Petey if he wants to accompany them. Petey allows the 2 men to take Stanley away, but before they leave, he cries out, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." Afterward, Petey returns to the living room table and picks up his newspaper. Meg arrives and asks if Stanley has come down to breakfast yet. Petey lies and tells her Stanley is still sleeping. The birthday party summary and analysis. Summary. The birthday party begins in the living room of an English seaside boarding house in the 1950s. There is a door leading to a hall on the left. A hatch, or interior window, opens to a kitchen in the back of the room. Table and chairs are situated in the foreground. Petey, a man in his 60s, enters the living room with his newspaper and sits at the table. His wife Meg, also in her 60s, greets him through the hatch. Meg appears with Petey's breakfast of cornflakes, and asks him, are they nice? Petey agrees that they are, and the couple then engages in dull conversation about the weather and about the birth announcement of a girl mentioned in the paper. Meg opines she would rather have a little boy than a girl, and then gives Petey a plate of fried bread, asking again whether it's nice. Petey says that it is. Petey then tells his wife that he met two men on the beach the night before, and that they had asked for a room. Meg is surprised by the news, but quickly recovers and considers that the men probably heard about their boarding house's reputation, since it's on the list. She does have a room prepared for visitors, although the two men would have to share it. Suddenly, Meg says she's going to wake that boy, indicating for the first time that there is a boarder in the house. Petey asks her if she already brought him his cup of tea, and Meg replies that she had watched him drink it earlier that morning. Meg then heads up the stairs and yells for Stanley Webber, insisting he come down for breakfast. She threatens to come up and get him otherwise. After a vocal count of 3, she races off stage and up the stairs. From off stage, Meg's laughter and Stanley's shouts are heard as Petey continues to read the paper. Meg re-enters, out of breath and adjusting her hair. She rushes to prepare Stanley's cornflakes. Stanley, a scruffy, bespectacled, unshaven man in his pajamas, enters and flops down in his seat at the table, where he stares morosely into his cornflakes. He and Petey exchange pleasantries about the weather, and Stanley complains that he can't eat his cereal because the milk has gone bad. Meg calls him a liar, but quickly replaces the cereal with fried bread. Petey rises and exits out the side door for work, leaving Meg and Stanley alone in the room. The mood immediately shifts. Stanley teases Meg, calling her a bad wife for not giving her husband a cup of tea in the morning. Meg bristles and tells him to mind his own business, but quickly turns flirtatious when Stanley uses the word succulent to describe her fried bread. She ruffles his hair, but he pushes her arm roughly away. Meg fetches a pot of tea and pours it, coyly telling Stanley he shouldn't call a married woman succulent. Stanley replies that a married woman has no place coming into his room and waking him up. Meg begins to dust the room and asks him if he really thinks she's succulent. He says that he does, but when she sensually strokes his arm and tells him she has had some lovely afternoons in that room, Stanley recoils and starts to lambaste her for the state of the house. His room needs cleaning and papering. He wants a new room. He continues to insult her and denies her a cigarette, even when she tries to tickle him with the feather duster. Either oblivious to his behaviour or accustomed to it, Meg changes the subject and mentions that two gentlemen are coming to stay. Stanley grows suddenly still. There has never been another boarder since he came to the house. He accuses her of lying, but Meg insists she is telling the truth. Stanley remains accusatory towards her, and they begin to shout until Stanley, very quietly, asks her, "Who do you think you're talking to?" This is the first indication of Stanley's mysterious past. Backtracking, he tells Meg that he has gotten a job, that he's going to travel the world, and that he is going to play piano as he once had. In a long monologue, he tells of a concert he once gave, stating that his father had almost come down to see him, but then suddenly changing his story to claim he never invited his father because he had lost the address. He describes the concert as a great success, but claims his next show was a disaster. Stanley refers to a mysterious collective, only calling it they, who boarded up the concert hall and pulled a fast one on him. They wanted me to crawl down on my bended knees. "Well, I can take a tip," he says. After his speech, Meg asks him not to leave. She tries to comfort him, but he cruelly claims that Ivan is approaching the house with a wheelbarrow that will take her away. She panics and accuses him of lying as he advances on her. A knock at the door interrupts them. Lulu, a young girl in her 20s, has arrived with a bulky package. Meg asks her to leave it in the living room, but to prohibit Stanley from opening it. Meg leaves to do her shopping as Lulu enters. She opens the door for air, and playfully insists Stanley needs a bath and a shave. She asks him to join her on a walk outside of the house. Stanley objects at first, but then agrees they should go somewhere, anywhere. When Lulu asks where they will go, Stanley replies, "Nowhere," and quickly recedes back into his own inner turmoil. Lulu affectionately calls him a washout and leaves. Stanley washes his face in the kitchen, and then exits. Two gentlemen, Goldberg and McCann, enter the room from the street. McCann is nervous, and wants assurance that Goldberg has brought them to the right house. Goldberg, in a pleasing tone, reassures McCann. Goldberg reminisces about his Uncle Barney, who used to bring him to the seaside on the second Friday of every month. McCann remains nervous, but Goldberg calmly insists that this impending job will be no different than those they have performed in the past. This perspective quiets McCann, who calls Goldberg a true Christian, and indicates that he is grateful for being invited on this job. Goldberg insists McCann is the best in his profession, and they settle into a discussion about the mysterious job they have come to perform. This is the first indication that a person in the boarding house is the job, though the particulars of the job remain unclear. Meg enters, and Goldberg charmingly introduces himself and McCann. He quickly establishes a flattering repartee with Meg, whom he calls a tulip. Meg informs the gentleman that they have arrived on Stanley Weber's birthday. Goldberg seems very interested in Stanley, and learns from Meg that he is her only boarder, that he once gave a concert, that he was a good pianist, and that he has been at the boarding house for some time. Goldberg suggests that they throw an impromptu birthday party for Stanley. Meg is thrilled at the idea, and decides she will wear her party dress. She then shows the gentleman to their room, at McCann's insistence. Meanwhile, Stanley re-enters the room and sits at the table. When Meg re-enters, he bombards her with questions about the gentlemen. Who are they? What are their names? When are they leaving? Stanley is visibly upset when he learns Goldberg's name. He sits very still as Meg reassures him that the men will not bother him. To cheer him up, she gives him the package that Lulu had brought over. Fatigued, he denies that it is his birthday, but Meg refuses to listen. He opens the package to find a toy drum with 2 drumsticks. Meg asks him to give her a kiss and he does, albeit upon her cheek. She asks him to play, and he hangs the drum from his neck and prances around the table tapping a merry beat. Then, Stanley suddenly begins to bang the drum erratically, almost savagely. He arrives at her chair and, leaning in towards her face, he bangs the drum harder and harder as if he were possessed. The curtain closes on Act I. Analysis. Overall, the birthday party is both extremely conventional and entirely unique. Most of its elements are easy to recognize and understand, but the relationships between those elements is slippery and difficult to pinpoint. Pinter's work is prized for the way it approaches and comments upon the limitations of communication, and the birthday party is no exception. The play, especially in performance, suggests that our attempts to communicate with one another are futile and often tinged with deep-seated resentments that we are unable to fully articulate. The truth, in other words, lies in the silence, not in the words characters use. To best understand the play, it is useful to know about the famous Pinter pause. Even a cursory scan of the play will reveal how precisely Pinter uses silence and pauses in telling his story. While it is perhaps not accurate to interpret this silence as deliberately designed to communicate an idea, it certainly does create a general unease, a feeling of sinister motives, that has become a hallmark of the writer's work. Please see the Theatre of the Absurd section of the note for more specifics about this style. Act I of the birthday party opens with a traditional domestic scene of a husband and wife around the breakfast table. Their conversation is bland but comfortable. On the page, it can seem hardly theatrical. There is no conflict, no exposition, and no challenge to expectation. However, Hidden beneath the surface of Petey and Meg's morning routine is a heavy sense of apathy, a recurring theme within the play. Both Petey and Meg, like Stanley, have accepted their tedious existence to the point that they fear change, as proven by Meg's reaction in Act the Third when she does not have breakfast ready. Her morning routine is disrupted and she's extremely upset. In performance, one can sense the undercurrent, which gives the scene tension if not conflict. Again, their relationship on the surface seems perfect in the silence beneath it. However, an audience can sense a problem. The specific setting of the birthday party is an English boarding house on an unnamed coast in the 1950s, but it is also set within the generalized idea of the home and the family. By establishing such a recognizable setting, the domestic home painter sets the stage to reverse the expectation and make commentary upon it. Effectively, he reinvents the domestic scene by adding elements of confusion and chaos. This juxtaposition led critic Irving Wardle to describe the play as a comedy of menace, one in which a seemingly realistic scene is complicated by lies, deceit and confusion. Stanley, as a character, represents the essence of confusion. He lies about his past, speaks shrewdly, lies regularly, and later denies any wrongdoing, even though Goldberg and McCann, who are also shrouded in mystery, strongly insist upon his guilt. Painter establishes the layers of social norms so that he can later peel them back to reveal the ugly potential of the human condition. Act I also introduces the odd relationship between Meg and Stanley. When Petey is present, Meg refers to Stanley as "that boy," a stern but affectionate choice for her boarder. Of course, their relationship is far more intimate. Painter explores the difference between her relationship with the men through the motif of tea, or making tea. Meg does not forget Stanley's tea, but she does forget Petey's. Stanley later calls her a bad wife for sending her husband to work without any tea, and what is implied is that she is far more interested in having tea ready when she's left alone with the boarder. Their sexual tension is abundantly clear, though the particulars of their relationship remain ambiguous. Meg is much older than Stanley, which allows the reader to create his or her own details. Is Stanley taking advantage of a lonely old woman? Did they have a sexual relationship that faltered? An examination of their relationship reveals how ambiguous Painter's play truly is. Stanley openly flirts with Meg as she preens and struts about the room, fishing for compliments. Unlike her conversation with Petey, which centers on whether the food was nice and other pleasantries, Meg wishes to know whether Stanley finds her nice. She wants intimacy with him. She wants to something deeper than her relationship with Petey affords. In effect, she is confessing the depth of her loneliness, her desire to break from an apathetic routine, but she cannot fully express this. Instead, we are meant to discover it while she is more than happy simply to be called succulent. It can be argued that Meg is simply delusional. Certainly, she harbors delusions about the quality of her house. She believes it is on the list, but its shabby quality is mentioned by Stanley on several occasions. In Act the Second, Stanley will insist to Goldberg and McCann that it is not even a boarding house. Even if it is, its lack of boarders speaks volumes about its quality and reputation. However, her greatest and most poignant delusions involve her relationship to Stanley. She may not have even had an affair with him. He may merely see her as comic relief, or as a way to ensure his security in the house. Her sentimental touches and her affectionate reminder of having spent many lovely afternoons in his room only inspire violent and rash outbursts from him. Is he tired of her flirtatious ways and delusions, or is he guilty of having entered into an affair with his much older, married landlady? Has Stanley taken advantage of her? They certainly seem familiar with one another, since Stanley allows her to enter his room uninvited, but again, Painter leaves the exact details up to his audience, yet their conversation is barbed as well as comfortable. Meg worries both that Stanley will grow angry with her and that he will leave. The latter fear might connect to the pain of her own father's betrayal, as described in Act the Second. Regardless, it is rooted in a desire to break from the apathy of her life. Through the eyes of this younger man, Meg can see herself not as a generic housewife, but as something special, not as a failure. Her business is quite meager, after all, but as a worthwhile woman. Stanley, on the other hand, is defined not by his fear but by his disgust. He is disgusted by himself, by the boarding house, and by Meg, who represents his guilty conscience, his jailer, or both. While she is comfortable because she accepts who he is, one could argue that she also makes him see himself too clearly, and hence does he hate her as well as accept her. Painter never confirms or denies the intimate details of Meg and Stanley's relationship. Petey, however, offers some insight when he lies to Meg about Stanley's whereabouts at the end of Act the Third. He knows she will be hurt when she finds that Stanley has left, and in an effort to spare his wife pain, he allows her to go about her domestic routine instead of telling her the truth. If nothing else, Petey recognizes her delusion, her need to find self-worth through the border. There is no specific incident within the play which conclusively determines what Petey knows of Meg and Stanley's relationship, but lack of closure certainly aligns with the play's general ambiguities. Confusion, one of the most dominant themes within the play, is perpetuated by the characters' needs to maintain their delusions by lying to one another. Stanley consistently lies within the play. He tells Meg he has a new job and will be leaving, but in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Stanley does not want to leave the boarding house, and yet he feels trapped there, stuck in the mindless and repetitive world of Meg and Petey's relationship. He is both drawn to and disgusted by the safety of such a lifestyle. The exile is in many ways self-imposed, considering that he refuses Lila's invitation to leave. His lies to Meg could be interpreted as yet another cruelty towards her, but they also reveal the extent of his self-hatred, and the brief respite these delusions bring. When he does cross the line into cruelty, telling Meg that she will be taken away by a wheelbarrow, he does not realize how poignantly he foreshadows his own fate within the play. Stanley, like the other characters, is not what he seems. His continued deceit discredits him as a trustworthy character, and yet he suggests that he might indeed have a shady past when he asks Meg, "Tell me, Mrs. Bowles, when you address yourself to me, do you ever ask yourself who exactly you are talking to?" Such an address could suggest one of two pasts, either an entitled, wealthy background, or the self-appointed swagger of a violent man. Further, he lies about his father, confusing even himself. Even he has forgotten what is true. As he continues his story about the concerts, he begins to reveal serious paranoia. His passion during this part of the speech suggests either that he is speaking truthfully or that his delusions have taken over. Meg does mention that he used to play piano at the pier, so the talent itself is not an invention, even if it now lays dormant. Either way, Stanley seems to believe he has been forced from his career and vocation. Perhaps an initial nervous breakdown forced him from a high life, real or imagined, to this secluded seaside boarding house. Regardless, he has certainly left his old life behind, and now sees fit to reinvent the particulars of his old life. The question is whether, for Stanley, the difference between the reality and his delusion really matters. Adding to the play's confusing atmosphere is the miscommunication manifest in Pinter's use of language. Miscommunication is another recurring theme throughout the play. Each character uses language not only to express himself, but also to further his own cause, lie, mislead, and simply cause pain. Painter once reflected that he had used too many dashes in the birthday party, and not enough dots. Although his example is esoteric, his meaning is clear. The language serves to confuse us, even as the characters give lots of information. For instance, Goldberg's long-winded speeches reflect on a past which may or may not have relevance towards his current circumstances, and may or may not suggest a deeper interpretation. The dialogue is outwardly conversational, but his deliberately paced silences and carefully chosen language suggests a deeper turmoil than the characters mean to express. Consider how the superficiality of the opening dialogue hides deep apathy, or how Goldberg's charming demeanor only makes his presence doubly sinister. Similarly, Stanley's hesitancy masks a deeper turmoil. His rash outbursts represent his fear, or perhaps his guilt. One of the most telling moments of the act chooses no dialogue at all. Stanley's possessive beating of the drum not only feeds the foreboding atmosphere, but foreshadows his own descent into madness. Goldberg and McCann's conversation in Act I showcases Pinter's use of language as a dramatic element. Their entrance creates chaos, as they throw the seemingly unoriginal day at the boarding house into a state of perplexity. Goldberg and McCann's friendly but businesslike conversation ironically creates ominous atmosphere. They are here to do a job. By avoiding the particulars, the audience is left to construct their own sinister details, an effect made doubly effective when performances utilize the rhythmic silence and pauses. Goldberg's cryptic message is partly for the benefit of the audience. Painter certainly does not want to give too much away, and yet Painter himself may not know what the job is. He was famous for following his characters intuitively, learning about them as he wrote, rather than determining their identities before writing. If we accept this approach as true, then Painter himself would have discovered the existence of a job precisely at this point of the play, and continued writing to determine its conclusion. As there is no conclusive resolution within the birthday party, one can assume that Painter did not know what happened to Stanley after he left the boarding house. He may not know what Goldberg and McCann's job is, or if they successfully completed it. What this suggests, then, is that plot is far less important than atmosphere, and the general commentary on the limits of communication. Painter's later works would examine characters similar to Goldberg and McCann, who represented a corrupt organization. However, in this early work, the two gentlemen only represent a potential organization from which they may have been charged with a job. At its core, the birthday party is frustrating from a story perspective but wildly successful in terms of atmosphere. Its sense of confusion and delusion are all the more powerful for its narrative ambiguities. Act the Second. Summary. Act the Second is set later that night. McCann sits at the table alone, methodically tearing pages of newspaper into 5 equal strips. Stanley enters the room, and is startled to see McCann. He starts to escape toward the kitchen, but changes course and casually greets McCann. When he hears some laughter nearby, he asks who it might be, but McCann does not answer. He drinks a glass of water in the kitchen and then tries to leave. As Stanley approaches the door, McCann intercepts him. They introduce themselves and exchange pleasantries, although there is a barbed undertone to the exchange. McCann insists Stanley stay for the birthday party that night, even though Stanley claims it is not his birthday and that the party will be just another booze-up. McCann whistles The Mountains of Mourne, an Irish folk song which Stanley recognizes. They whistle the tune together. Stanley then tries to leave again, but McCann insists he stay. Stanley acquiesces, and they sit together at the table. Stanley asks McCann if they have ever met before. McCann denies it, and grows angry when Stanley touches one of the strips of newspaper. Stanley insists that they have met before, but McCann again denies it. Stanley tells how he once lived a quiet life, rarely going outdoors. However, business brought him to the boarding house, and he has been there ever since. He also insists he is the same man that he had always been, though he admits his appearance has faded from drink. He considers how no one would ever expect him to be a man who would cause trouble. He picks up a strip of newspaper, and McCann sternly chides him for it. Stanley's demeanor suddenly changes, and he asks McCann why he and Goldberg have come to the boarding house. McCann deflects the questions and observes that Stanley seems depressed on his birthday. Stanley again denies it's his birthday, and offers that Meg has gone round the bend. Becoming upset, Stanley grabs McCann's arm and insists the other sit down and listen to him. McCann savagely hits Stanley and pushes him away. Stanley, slightly mollified, insists again that he and McCann have met before, and that McCann is being deceitful. Stanley demands his story is true. He once lived in Basingstoke and rarely left his home. He had things delivered to his door, and he was practically recluse. Suddenly, he switches topics and tells McCann of his fondness for Ireland and its people, especially its sunsets and policemen. McCann seems unimpressed. Petey and Goldberg arrive, and Stanley is introduced to the latter. Goldberg tells the group about his mother, and about a former girlfriend whom he had once loved but whom he had never unfairly taken advantage of. He tells how his mother called him Simey, and prepared gefilte fish for dinner. Goldberg asks Stanley about his childhood, but Stanley is unresponsive. Petey leaves for a game of chess with friends, and McCann follows to buy alcohol for the party. Stanley and Goldberg are left alone in the room. Goldberg, at ease, makes small talk, but Stanley won't listen. Instead, he tells Goldberg there has been some kind of mistake, that the boarding house has no rooms left for them and so they must leave. Goldberg smoothly changes the subject to birthdays, comparing them to waking up in the morning. He says some people know how to appreciate the wonder of waking up, while others act as if their corpse is waiting to be washed. McCann returns with some bottles, which he sets down on the sideboard. Stanley again insists they leave, but this time, Goldberg and McCann respond aggressively, insisting Stanley sit down. McCann insists forcefully, but it is Goldberg's quiet, threatening tone that effectively inspires Stanley to acquiesce. They begin to interrogate Stanley with a series of both unnerving and seemingly unrelated questions. Through their quick, short questions, they reveal details of Stanley's past to the audience, or at least details of the past they have fabricated for him. Their interrogation suggests that Stanley chases Petey from the house so that he can drive Meg crazy, and that he treats Lulu like a leper. When they ask why he came to the boarding house, Stanley claims it was because his feet hurt. They accuse him of betraying their organization, of being a traitor to the cloth, and of changing his name. They claim he left a girl at the altar, but also claim that he once had a wife whom he killed either by poison or by beating her to death. Stanley vehemently denies all of these claims. Goldberg and McCann's questions grow irrational, and include queries like, why did the chicken cross the road? And, who watered the wick in Melbourne? Goldberg asks the difference between the possible and the necessary. They accuse him of lechery and of mother defiling. They insist he is dead because he does not truly live. When they tell him he is nothing but an odor, Stanley suddenly comes to life and kicks Goldberg in the stomach. Before they can react, Meg comes down the stairs beating the drum. Meg enters the room dressed for the party. She places the drum on the table, and the Sienna's mood immediately brightens as Goldberg resumes his suave demeanor. McCann helps Stanley pour the drinks. Stanley is overwhelmed, but calm. Goldberg slaps Meg on her behind in a playful manner as he admires her dress, and encourages Meg to give a toast. Meg hesitantly but affectionately tells Stanley that she is happy he is staying at her boarding house, and that he is her Stanley now even if he pretends otherwise. She starts to cry. Lulu enters. There is an immediate attraction between Goldberg and Lulu. The party guests pair off. Lulu with Goldberg, McCann with Meg. Stanley remains alone, and the dialogue shifts between the two couples. Goldberg and Lulu engage in a conversation filled with sexual innuendos revolving around childhood imagery and children's games. Lulu confesses that she likes older men, and sits on Goldberg's lap while he bounces her. She wonders whether Goldberg knew her when she was a child, and says he reminds her of the first man she ever loved. Meanwhile, Meg and McCann speak drunkenly of Ireland, and Meg conjectures that her father might have gone there after he abandoned the family when she was still a child. The talk of childhood inspires Meg to request a game. They decide on Blind Man's Buff, and Meg blindfolds herself and stumbles about the room searching for the others. She stumbles across McCann, who then dons the blindfold while Goldberg fondles Lulu. McCann finds Stanley and ties the blindfold on him. In the process, he maliciously breaks Stanley's glasses. While Stanley stumbles around the room, uncharacteristically silent, McCann places the toy drum on the floor, and Stanley steps in it. 1 foot in the drum, he continues to meander until he comes across Meg. Suddenly, Stanley lashes out and tries to strangle her. Goldberg and McCann rush forward and rescue her. Then, the lights go out. Confusion ensues as the characters bump into one another. McCann loses his flashlight, while Lulu screams and faints. In the dark, Stanley places her on the table. When McCann finally finds his flashlight, he shines it on the table, where Stanley stands over Lulu, who is unconscious with her legs spread open. It resembles of sexual assault. As he is struck by the light, Stanley begins to giggle and retreats towards the kitchen. Goldberg and McCann slowly approach him, and finally converge on him as he continues to laugh, louder and louder. The curtain closes on Act 2 amid confusion and chaos. Analysis. The most prominent conflict in Act 2 is that between order and chaos. The act opens with a symbol of order taken to an almost perverse extreme. McCann methodically tears the newspaper into identical strips. The symbol serves as representation of how he and Goldberg approach their job. They are insidious and deliberate in their infiltration of the house, and not too quick to make their move. Interestingly, this same symbol will represent the chaos they leave behind when it resurfaces in Act the Third. The tension between Stanley and McCann also reflects this conflict. On the surface, both men do their best to subscribe to social convention. Stanley is clearly unnerved and paranoid, and yet will not deliberately accuse McCann of what he suspects. Instead, he attempts to talk around the perceived threat, which further reflects the play's theme of imperfect communication. Similarly, McCann remains civil despite Stanley's bad attitude, at least until the latter touches the newspaper. By threatening to disrupt the semblance of order, Stanley insults McCann and leads him towards violence. Once Stanley has disturbed their semblance of order, he takes an offensive tact and tries to dictate the terms of the conversation. He insists upon his version of his own past, in effect defending himself against a perceived threat. The audience is left to fill in any details. Is Stanley telling the truth? What are the sins McCann thinks him guilty of? Even as Stanley demands his version is the absolute truth. Questions of identity, of who we think ourselves to be and who we truly are, resurface in this act. Whereas in Act I, Stanley and Meg's conversation touched on dubious realities but had low stakes, the stakes here are much higher. We perceive that Stanley could be hurt if he cannot convince these men to accept his version of his past. The idea of an imprecise identity is reinforced in Stanley and McCann's exchange over previous acquaintance. McCann insists they have never met before, despite Stanley's insistence to the contrary. Though Pinter does not give us details on Stanley's past, Stanley's behavior during this exchange suggests some past sin or crime. He is extremely paranoid even as he tries to maintain an air of civility, and insists preemptively that he does not seem the type of man who would ever cause any trouble. To confront the perceived threat would be to break decorum and risk violence, so Stanley relies on innuendo and subtext to communicate his point. McCann, a paragon of order and calm here, is unfazed. Ultimately, the opening conversation is a masterpiece of theatrical conversation. There are many interpretations we can make, but we can only conjecture on motivations. The sudden shifts of intention, tone, and subject in the dialogue create through performance an uneasy feeling, a sense that nothing we see is easily categorized. While every bit of the conversation is easy to understand on its own, the overarching subtext, what is really going on, is elusive. Words do not capture our meaning, the play suggests. Instead, they become a trap that fails to properly express our worries and emotions. The only act that truly shifts the power dynamic is McCann's assault. When he hits Stanley, both men understand for a moment what is going on. However, once they return to language, the confusion and disorientation resumes. Goldberg offers similarly ironic contradictions. A master of language, he knows how to make people respond to him. Both men, like Petey, and women, like Meg and Lulu, respond to his suave ways. And yet behind this seeming control is a sense of gleeful chaos and violence. He uses his control of orderly language to disguise a vicious intent. Clearly, he is not a hitman insistent on efficiency. If he were, he and McCann could easily overpower Uncle Stanley. Instead, he attempts to manipulate the situation, to force Stanley into a madness of paranoia. Goldberg intentionally creates chaos, but does so by manipulating the orderliness of language. This sense is apparent from the moment he enters the act, with Petey. His story about his mother and a former lover seems to profess proper attitudes on women, even as it unnerves Stanley. Some scholars of the birthday party propose that Stanley's past crime involved a woman, either his wife or a young Irish girl. This interpretation is supported both by the story and by several references during their interrogation scene. They mention that he was once married, and might have either killed his wife or left a woman at the altar. That they contradict themselves is not important, it's only language, after all. But what is important is the repeated motif of violence towards women. Further, Stanley's attitudes help support this theory. Not only was he emotionally cruel towards Meg in Act I, but in Act II, He attempts to strangle her before preparing to sexually assault Lulu. Stanley is driven to a sort of madness by his oppressors, but rather than being the cause of this behavior, the madness arguably enables Stanley to act out his true self. As with any interpretation of this play, it is impossible to prove definitively, though a repeated cruelty towards women does support the idea that Stanley is guilty of such crimes. One of the play's most famous scenes is the interrogation, for several reasons. Most prominent is Pinter's use of language and overlapping dialogue. The interrogation begins with somewhat legitimate questions, but quickly falls into a surreal mirage of ridiculousness. Both tactics, coming so quick on top of one another, serve to deepen Stanley's paranoia, and lay the foundation for his nervous breakdown at the end of Act the Second. In performance, this scene plays quickly and violently, with the ridiculousness of the language only reinforcing the sinister, tortuous intent of the characters. Again, what they say is less affecting than the way they say it, the true motivation behind the meaningless words. There is almost a sense of a confession in the interrogation. Once Stanley submits to their judgment, he is quickly annihilated. This suggests a sense of unconfessed guilt, especially since their assessment of him is neither totally flawed nor totally truthful. After all, they contradict themselves, but he lacks the fortitude to argue. Instead, the interrogation forces him into a stupor that will not cease until he breaks down during the game. He will never again be the loquacious, arrogant fellow of Act I. He now has to look inward and confront whatever sins he has internalized. What he has done is never revealed. That he has done something is beyond question. The one remark that does enliven Stanley is the accusation that he is only an otter. By this point of the interrogation, Stanley has been reduced to a groaning animal, but the fear of death evoked by this claim is strong enough to force his resistance. They have pushed him too far and they prepare to be attacked, before they are saved by Meg's entrance. Suddenly, order resumes. The scene quickly dissolves into civility once more as Goldberg again evokes a brighter tone. As the party kicks into gear, Goldberg controls the room through his command of language, while Stanley remains in a stupor. Order and chaos share the stage, and while most of the characters are drawn towards Goldberg's controlled order, the audience is aware of the chaos in Stanley, which creates a suspense and tension as counterpoint to the civility of the celebration. Meanwhile, the theme of sexuality and the objectification of women continues to manifest through Goldberg's actions. He speaks to Lulu as a little girl, a role she quickly accepts when she bounces on his knee. It is a sick parody of the father-slash-daughter relationship, a parallel to Meg's strange, sexual mother-slash-son relationship with Stanley. What a contradictory and confusing image, especially since Goldberg has come supposedly to punish Stanley for similar crimes. However, Goldberg's hypocrisy would never bother him after all. His atonement is not at issue. Finally, blindness becomes a motif in this act. The final act that breaks Stanley is the destruction of his glasses, which leaves him blind to the world. The darkness of the blindfold reflects his confusion over the reasons for his torture, and is further manifest in the darkness that overtakes the room. However, when light is finally brought back, we see Stanley as he truly is, ready to repeat some kind of violence. The act closes on chaos. Order has broken down, and the truth of Stanley's ugliness has come to light. The order he has maintained for these years on the boarding house has proved as fragile as the drum. Act the Third. Summary. Act the Third is set the next morning. Petey sits at the kitchen table reading his newspaper. Meg calls out to him, thinking he is Stanley. When she enters and realizes it's Petey, she confesses she has run out of cornflakes and that she has a headache from the party. She also tells Petey that the drum is broken. He reassures her that she can always get another one. Meg wants to call Stanley down to breakfast, but Petey stops her, saying, "Let him sleep. This morning, let him sleep." Meg misses Petey's cryptic tone, and tells him how she tried to bring Stanley his tea earlier, but was stopped in the hallway by McCann, who informed her that Stanley had already had tea. Peter interrupts her story to ask when she will go food shopping. She hurries out the door for that purpose, but quickly returns with news that a car is parked outside. Frightened, she asks if Petey had looked in the car and noticed whether there was a wheelbarrow in it. When Petey tells her it's Goldberg's car, she is relieved. Just as Meg prepares to leave again, she hears footsteps on the stairs and thinks it is Stanley coming down for breakfast. She flutters about, distressed that she cannot offer him cornflakes. However, it turns out to be Goldberg, which upsets Meg. Goldberg assures her that Stanley will be down eventually. Meg asks him questions about his car, but Goldberg ignores her and instead speaks to Petey about the car's reliability. After Meg leaves, Petey asks Goldberg about Stanley, and Goldberg explains that Stanley suffered a nervous breakdown at the party. Though he cannot explain why or how it happened, Goldberg is certain that is the case. Petey explains how he came home the night before to find the lights out, and had to put a shilling in the slot to reactivate the power. He then ran into McCann, who first told him about what happened. Goldberg senses Petey's worry and reassures him that they will connect Stanley with a fellow named Monty, whom Goldberg considers the best doctor available. Petey argues with Goldberg, suggesting Stanley should stay at the boarding house, but Goldberg quickly dismisses his offer. Petey exits to the kitchen as McCann enters. He has packed their bags and is anxious to leave. He refuses to go up there again, and says Stanley is trying to shove his broken glasses into his eyes. Petey reappears and offers to fix the glasses with sellotape, but Goldberg again refuses his help. Petey says he has to tend the peas in the garden, but asks to be called when Stanley comes down. However, Goldberg is adamant that Petey should be gone when they leave, and in a pleasant but anxious tone of voice, he suggests that Petey go to the pier to set up the deck chairs for tourists. Petey says he's fine where he is, and then exits to the garden, leaving an exhausted Goldberg. McCann picks up Petey's newspaper and begins to shred it into strips. Goldberg demands he stop calling the activity childish. McCann says he wants to get it over, and asks Goldberg whether he should bring Stanley downstairs. Goldberg ignores the question, and instead tells McCann that he feels knocked out. Angry at being ignored, McCann grabs the back of Goldberg's chair and shouts at him to get the thing done. When Goldberg does not respond, McCann calls him Nut, and when it does not elicit a response, calls him Simey. Goldberg reacts immediately and violently at this name, screaming, "Never call me that," as he seizes McCann by the throat. Backpedaling, McCann denies using the name, and then asks if he should fetch Stanley. Instead of answering, Goldberg asks McCann to look in his mouth, and then claims he has never been sick and still has all of his teeth. Goldberg next reminisces about his father, whose deathbed words were, "Never forget your family, for they are the rock, the constitution, the core." Goldberg rambles a bit, and then asks McCann to blow into his mouth, which McCann does twice without question. The activity calms Goldberg down. Lulu enters, and McCann leaves them alone, promising to return within 5 minutes. Lulu accuses Goldberg of using her for his perverse, sexual games. He swears he has never touched another woman, but she does not believe him. She wonders what her father would think of their sexual activity, which she does not describe. She claims that her first lover, Eddie, was respectful and never used her as Goldberg did, for a passing fancy. Goldberg insists their liaison was consensual, but she counters that he took advantage of her while her defenses were down. She also mentions a mysterious briefcase that Goldberg brought in which she opened out of curiosity. When McCann enters and hears her mention the briefcase, he threateningly asks her whether she has anything to confess. Goldberg senses her confusion and adds that McCann has only been unfrocked for 6 months. McCann chases her away, and the men's conversation returns to Stanley's condition. McCann leaves the room, and quickly returns with a clean-shaven Stanley, who holds his broken glasses in his hands as he sits quietly in a chair. Goldberg compliments Stanley's appearance and promises to buy him a new pair of glasses. He and McCann then try to entice Stanley to accompany them of his own free will. They promise they want to care for him, to save him from a fate worse than death, and to make a man out of him. In an assault that mirrors the second interrogation, they bombard Stanley with promises which grow more ridiculous as the scene progresses. For example, they promise to gift him earplugs, stomach pumps, and crutches while they help him skip rope. During their speeches, Stanley remains immobile, his gaze distant. Goldberg kindly but firmly demands to know how Stanley feels about their offer to take him away. After a few moments of silence, Stanley attempts to speak but can only muster gurgling sounds. He continues to try, but ultimately drops his chin to his chest, converging in on himself as he produces nonsense words and sounds. Goldberg gently takes Stanley in hand and leads him towards the door. Meanwhile, Petey has arrived, unnoticed, and insists they leave Stanley alone with him. Goldberg and McCann then turn towards Petey and insidiously suggest that he should accompany them as well. Though Petey does not stop them from leaving the house, he does shout, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." Petey turns toward the table and sits down. He picks up his newspaper and begins to read. Meg enters and asks after Stanley. With trepidation in his voice, Petey lies and says Stanley is still sleeping. Meg tells him that she had a lovely time at the party, forgetting that Petey was not there. In her closing remark, Meg insists that she was the belle of the ball, and Petey agrees with her assessment. Analysis. As a whole, the structure of the birthday party seems very traditional. There are 3 acts, arranged in chronological order, and the first and third acts parallel one another. Both Act I and Act the Third begin with Meg and Petey's morning routine, although Act the Third reflects the play's descent into depravity. Meg does not have breakfast to serve in Act 3, and she is frantic to remedy the oversight. As an interesting side detail, she does remember to pour Petey's tea, whereas she forgot in Act I. Because of what she has gone through since Act I, Meg is ungrounded, not so easily submerged into the superficial routine of the beginning. In many ways, Petey is the central character of Act the Third, since he changes during it. At the beginning, when Meg realizes that the drum has broken but does not remember how it happened, Petey simply tells her she can get another one. There is a bit of dramatic irony since the audience realizes that the drum represents Stanley. Much as it is broken, so is he mentally unstable. Petey's growth in the act is realizing that while Meg could conceivably get a new boarder like Stanley, his particular absence will likely shatter her fragile world. The play ends with his lie to her, a lie intended to prolong her eventual breakdown. Considering the implications that Petey might have a sense of the strange Meg/Stanley relationship, his desire to maintain her illusion reveals his discovery of Stanley's importance. If she falls apart, then their pleasant, comfortable life might also fall apart. Petey is also central because we realize he might always have had some interest in his world's sinister nature. He has largely been absent from the play thus far, and in many ways is pitiable for being a potentially willing cuckold, something Goldberg and McCann suggest to Stanley during their Act the Second interrogation. Yet Petey reveals an astuteness in Act 3 through his conversation about Stanley's mental breakdown. The fact that he is not surprised to hear Goldberg suggest it gives us reason to suspect he had seen indications of mental problems before. When we learn that Petey is an accomplished chess player, the symbol helps us to understand him. He seems to know more than any other single character. He knows that Goldberg and McCann are not what they seem. He knows that Stanley might have mental problems. He knows that his wife's mental problems might be exacerbated if he were to enter affair with Stanley. And he realizes when he cannot win the battle to keep Stanley around. And yet he chooses to live in a pleasant stupor, to not address any of these problems. Certainly, this can be interpreted as cowardice, but it is not accidental. Like a chess player, he knows how to strategize, and has chosen a life of pleasant comfort over potential difficulties. He chooses not to live, in the sense that Goldberg accuses Stanley of in Act the Second, but it is a choice. When he yells to Stanley, "Don't let them tell you what to do," he is in many ways describing his own life, one in which he engages nobody and hence has little responsibility. He is cowardly safe in his domestic delusion, but it is his own choice. The act is full of sinister images and situations. Meg's discovery of the black car brings a theatrical mystery to the fore, and she immediately interprets it as a sign of her own breakdown. She remembers Stanley's threat to have her taken away in a wheelbarrow, and worries this car is intended for that purpose. As a vehicle intended to remove debris from place to place, the wheelbarrow represents motion of unworthy objects. Meg's fear of the wheelbarrow reflects not only her fear of her own irrelevance, but also her fear of movement, of change from the comfort wherein she can maintain her delusions of importance. What is ironic is that Stanley's threat has come true not for her, but for himself. And yet her fear over the black car is not misplaced, as we can intuit from the earlier acts. Stanley's absence might in fact compromise her own sanity. Goldberg also reveals the depth of the sinister potential in Act the Third. He is able to maintain some air of charm, apparent when he assuages Meg's concerns about the car, but he refuses to answer any questions about it. His silence about certain details only deepens the aura of dread that permeates the play, both in terms of the car and in terms of other details, like the briefcase or his purpose for Stanley. Most sinister is Goldberg's own breakdown. His world is clearly coming undone, most likely as a result of whatever sexual behavior he forced upon Lulu. Whereas he has shown nothing but suave detachment in Act 2, he is a wreck in Act the Third, knocked out and undone. He is unnerved by such feelings, since he has never been sick before. He lacks his characteristic control, even lashing out at McCann for calling him Simey. Is this sickness perhaps a sign of a guilty conscience, or has his liaison with Lulu submerged some childhood neuroses? As he mentioned the name Simey as a name from his past, this latter interpretation could certainly be defended. What Goldberg's breakdown reveals is that every person is reliant upon his own delusion, and hence subject to pain and difficulty when that delusion falters. Though he has presented himself as strong and untouchable, Goldberg centers his world around a pretense of family morals, of a nostalgia for the old days, which were better, bigger, and more respectful. Considering the way he speaks of his mother in Act the Second, it is possible to interpret this delusion as an expression of childhood and control. Indeed, he shows a desire to be something of a parent both to Stanley, whom he forces into an infantile state of confusion and fear, and to Lulu, who he treated as a daughter in Act the Second and then as a prostitute in Act the Third. Lulu's confrontation leads Goldberg into further lies about her compliance, a situation he does not handle well until McCann finally chases her away. Interestingly, his final tactic is to elicit a confession from her. In a world where we are guilty of our own delusions and sins, forced confession becomes a threat. Stanley's situation also reveals the sinister nature of the play. Ironically, he is most frightening because he is suddenly so presentable. The reprise of their Act the Second interrogation now has the sense less of attack and more of a bedside vigil. All of his delusions shattered, Stanley can only receive these promises silently. With repeated readings or viewings of the play, an audience might realize how Stanley's breakdown could be any person's fate if he or she were forced to confront his or her past sins and delusions too forcibly. From this perspective, the scene is even more horrifying. At the end, Meg remains blissfully unaware of the situation. It is telling that the play ends with a confirmation of her delusion. The final exchange is full of dramatic irony. She has constructed a reality that we know to be false, both because Meg was not the belle of the ball, and because Petey was not there to know it. The play ends with a scenario of ambiguity and delusion, which falls perfectly in line with the themes it explores throughout. In a published speech entitled "Writing for the Theatre," Painter offered that Petey's exclamation, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do," defined his mindset, his plays, and his entire career. Neither Painter nor his characters conform to established means of interpretation, and he makes every effort to avoid easy answers that could be interpreted as the author's moral message. Instead, we are to leave Painter's plays, The Birthday Party included, unsure exactly what is true, both about the character on stage and about ourselves. Major themes: confusion and chaos. A key element of The Absurdist Theatre is its focus on confusion and chaos. In The Birthday Party, these elements manifest constantly, especially through its characters. The primary way in which the themes manifest are through the ambiguities of lives and pasts. Stanley has some sort of mysterious past that deserves a violent reckoning, but nobody really provides its details. When Stanley describes his past to Meg in Act I, there is even the sense that he himself is confused about its particulars. Goldberg's name and past seem shrouded in mystery and delusion, and Meg convinces herself to believe things about her life that are clearly not true. Further, because of these type of confusions, the situation devolves into total chaos. From the moment Goldberg and McCann arrive, the audience can sense that the simplicity of the boarding house is about to be compromised, and indeed, The chaos at the end of Act the Second confirms it. The only truth of the birthday party is that there is no truth, only chaos and confusion from which we make order if we choose. Complacency. Perhaps the most pessimistic aspect of the birthday party is that the only alternative Pinter gives to chaos and confusion is a life of apathy and complacency. The play's opening sets this up. Petey and Meg reveal a comfortable but bland life in which they talk in pleasantries and ignore anything of substance. Stanley might be more aggressive than they are, but he too has clearly chosen the safety of complacency, as he makes no effort to change his life. His lethargic lifestyle reflects the attraction comfort has for him. When Goldberg and McCann arrive, they challenge this complacent lifestyle until the whole place falls into chaos. Ultimately, Petey chooses to refortify the complacency of the boarding house over bravely fighting for Stanley. Neither choice is truly attractive. Language. The precision Pinter employs in crafting his rhythmic silences is enough to justify language as a major theme, but he moreover reveals how language can be used as a tool. Each of the characters uses language to his or her advantage. In effect, characters manipulate words to suggest deeper subtexts, so that the audience understands that true communication happens beneath language, and not through words themselves. When Stanley insults Meg, he is actually expressing his self-hatred and guilt. Goldberg is a master of language manipulation. He uses speeches to deflect others' questions, to redirect the flow of conversation, or to reminisce about past events. His words are rarely wasted. Meg, on the other hand, repeats herself, asking the same questions over and over again in a bid for attention. Even though she often speaks without affectation, her words mask a deep neurosis and insecurity. These are just a few examples of instances in which language is used not to tell the story, but to suggest that the story is hidden. In essence, language in the birthday party is a dangerous atonement. One of the great ironies in this play is that it uses what appears to be a fairly undramatic, realistic setting which nevertheless hides a surplus of guilt. The theme of atonement runs throughout the play. Stanley's past is never detailed, but he is clearly a guilty man. He is vague about his past, and does anything to distract Goldberg and McCann. He does not wish to atone for whatever he did, but is forced to do so through torture. Goldberg, too, wishes to avoid whatever sins torture him but cannot fully escape them. His mood in Act 3 shows that he is plagued by feelings he does not wish to have. In the end, all of the characters are like Lulu, who flees when McCann offers her a chance to confess. Everyone has sins to atone for, but nobody wants to face them. Nostalgia. Perhaps most fitting for a contemporary audience who would see this play as something of a period piece. The theme of nostalgia is implicit but significant in the birthday party. Goldberg, particularly, is taken by nostalgia, frequently waxing poetic both on his own past and on the good old days when men respected women. Certainly, Goldberg tells some of these stories to contrast with the way Stanley treats women, but they also suggest a delusion he has, a delusion that breaks down when he himself assaults Lulu between the second and third acts. He idealizes some past that he cannot live up to. Other characters reveal an affection for nostalgia as well. During the birthday party, Meg and Lulu both speak of their childhoods. However, their nostalgic feelings have darker sides. Meg remembers being abandoned, whereas Lulu's memories of being young lead Goldberg to bounce her perversely on his knee. Similarly, the characters play Blind Man's Bluff specifically because it makes them nostalgic, but the sinister side of such nostalgia is inescapable in the stage image of Stanley preparing to rape Lulu. Nostalgia is lovely to feel, the play seems to suggest, but more insidious in its complexities. Violence. The birthday party is full of violence, both physical and emotional, overall suggesting that violence is a fact of life. The violence is doubly affecting because the setting seems so pleasant and ordinary. Most of the men show their potential for violence, especially when provoked. Stanley is cruel and vicious towards Meg, but much more cowardly against other men. Both McCann and Goldberg have violent outbursts no matter how hard they try to contain themselves. Their entire operation, which boasts an outward civility, has an insidious purpose, most violent for the way it tortures Stanley slowly to force him to nervous breakdown. In both acts the second and 3, They reveal how language itself can be violent in the interrogation scenes. Much of the violence in the play concerns women. Stanley not only intimidates Meg verbally, but he also prepares to assault Lulu. Goldberg in fact does assault Lulu. Finally, the threat of violence is ever present in the play. Even before we realize that disaster might come, we can feel the potential through the many silences and tense atmosphere. Sexual tension is present throughout the entire play, and it results in tragic consequences. Meg and Stanley have a strange, possible sexual relationship that frees him to treat her very cruelly. The ugliness of his behavior is echoed when Goldberg calls him a mother defiler and the lecher. In fact, Goldberg suggests that Stanley's unnamed sin involves his poor treatment of a woman. Lulu seems interested in Stanley as well, but is quickly attracted to Goldberg in Act the Second. Her innocence makes her prey to men's sexuality. Her openness leads to 2 consecutive sexual assaults, and yet she is nevertheless upset to learn that Goldberg is leaving. All in all, it is a strange, perverse undercurrent throughout the play. Sex is acknowledged as a fact of life, and yet does not ever reveal positive aspects of the characters. Quotes and analysis. 1. Are they nice? Meg to Petey, 19. Meg's query to Petey reveals how important her delusions are to her. The play opens as Meg and Petey at breakfast. She asks Petey inane and repetitive questions, which sets the tone of not only their marriage but also the atmosphere of the boarding house. They are clearly in a rut. The boarding house is in disrepair and they have only one boarder, but Meg wants assurance to the contrary. Her delusion allows her escape from the tedium of her life, but it requires constant attention. 2. Oh Stan, that's a lovely room. I've had some lovely afternoons in that room. Meg to Stanley, 29. Although it is never openly stated, there is a strange sexually tinged relationship between Meg and Stanley. Meg is openly affectionate with him, sometimes in mothering ways, but more often in flirtatious ways. However, the cruelty with which Stanley rebukes her flirtation makes the truth ambiguous. Nevertheless, she ignores his repudiations, insisting he cares for her. Her delusions of importance and beauty require that she not only believe the affair is happening, but also that he enjoys it. When Meg says the above line, she is both indicating her belief in their affair, and revealing how she will reinvent his feelings to suit her delusion. It is a lovely room, no matter what he says. 3. You're a bit of a washout, aren't you? Lulu to Stanley, 36. Lulu is closer to Stanley's age than any other character is. She is described as an attractive woman in her 20s, but Stanley seems unimpressed. In Act I, Lulu berates Stanley for not leaving the house, and for always being underfoot. When Stanley refuses to go out with her, she insults him in the above manner. The insult still contains a bit of flirtation, though, which indicates both the strange relationship between men and women in the play, and her desperate desire to have someone so strong that she even pursues the out-of-sorts, lethargic boarder. 4. At all events, McCann, I can assure you that the assignment will be carried out and the mission accomplished with no excessive aggravation to you or myself. Satisfied. Goldberg to McCann, 40. In this reassurance to McCann, Goldberg reveals the depth of his insidiousness. Not only do they have a sinister purpose in mind, the assignment, but they will also treat it with little personal investment. The tone is businesslike and detached, which is unsettling when we realize that Stanley is the target. This quote also reveals the differences in their characters. At the top, Goldberg is collected, whereas McCann is jumpy. These roles later reverse somewhat. 5. Shall I put it around my neck? Stanley to Meg, 46. Like a noose, Stanley puts the toy drum Meg bought him for his supposed birthday around his neck. This death imagery adds to the ominous atmosphere, suggesting that things are about to change at the boarding house, and not for the better. This scene also indicates how Stanley's depressive rages can turn violent very quickly, as he wildly bangs the drums while the curtain closes. 6. Why do you call me sir? Stanley to McCann, 51. Stanley's mysterious past is alluded to in several scenes. Here, Stanley tries to convince McCann that they are mistaken about his identity without ever directly admitting that they might know him. It is one of the many scenes in which characters talk around one another. When McCann refers to Stanley as "Sir," he overreacts, suggesting that the truth of the scene is the tension beneath it, and not the meaningless language they use. 7. You're dead. You can't live, you can't think, you can't love. You're dead. You're a plague gone bad. There's no juice in you. You're nothing but an odor. Goldberg to Stanley, 62. During the bizarre interrogation scene in Act the Second, Goldberg gives this assessment, one of the play's most poignant. It is poignant because it is true not only of Stanley, but ostensibly of everyone in the play, as well as of the apathetic post-war Britain that Painter was commenting on. Too many of the characters choose comfort because it is safer, but the flip side is a depressing apathy. And, as the play suggests, the truth of life never goes away and will sooner or later rear its dangerous, ugly head. 8. Well, it's very, very nice to be here tonight, in my house, and I want to propose a toast to Stanley, because it's his birthday, and he's lived here for a long while now, and he's my Stanley now. And I think he's a good boy, although sometimes he's bad. And he's the only Stanley I know, and I know him better than all the world, although he doesn't think so. Well, I could cry because I'm so happy, having him here and not gone away, on his birthday, and there isn't anything I wouldn't do for him, and all you good people here tonight. Meg's toast, 65. Meg's rambling affection for Stanley explains why she has invited these strangers to his birthday party. In her simplistic fashion, she wants what is best for Stanley. She is the only person in the play who truly cares about him. However, her toast also reveals her own personal blindness. Part of his misery is her unceasing attention to him, and her delusions which he must continue to entertain. When he attempts to strangle her before being taken away after his breakdown, he shows her how he truly feels, which makes her delusions all the more upsetting. 9. Yes, she does sometimes. Sometimes she forgets. Petey to Goldberg, 80. Petey seems unconcerned during much of the play, but this line, spoken to Goldberg in Act the Third, shows he knows more than he lets on. When he explains that she sometimes gives him tea and sometimes forgets, he in some ways suggests that he sees nothing more than his physical surroundings. However, considering how tea is a symbol for Meg's affection, Stanley establishes this in Act I, and considering Petey's willingness to lie to her at the end about Stanley's disappearance, the line also has a significant subtext. Petey knows that his wife walks a fine line of sanity, held together by her delusions that can often distract her. 10. Let's finish and go. Let's get it over and go. Get the thing done. Let's finish the bloody thing. Let's get the thing done and go. McCann to Goldberg, 86. Usually, McCann is extremely deferential to Goldberg. Here, however, McCann is flustered and upset because of Goldberg's seeming disinterest in the job. McCann relies on Goldberg to keep them calm and focused, and Goldberg's trouble in this act make McCann doubly nervous. He does not want to get invested, since the job troubles him, but Goldberg has seemingly gotten invested. McCann cannot handle losing his calm mentor, and so he snaps for a moment. Suggested essay questions. 1. Discuss Stanley and Meg's relationship. Stanley and Meg's relationship is complicated and ambiguous, but clearly shows how depressed they both are. In the most obvious way, they are boarder and boarding house owner. However, there is also a mother/son dynamic at work. Meg mothers Stanley, fussing over his breakfast and kidding with him at the table. Most strange is their sexual dynamic. She also flirts with him by invading his room, tickling him, and affectionately touching his arm. She demands kisses in return for good behavior. Stanley responds to all her affronts with disgust, but this arguably comes from feeling trapped within her house. He makes no effort to change his life, and so must see his acceptance of her as the cost of living anonymously. Likewise, she sees in him an escape from the drudgery of her banal life with Petey. No matter what the truth of their relationship is, it is clear they accept it to fill in deeper fears and insecurities. 2. How does the state of the boarding house mirror the personalities of the characters? The house, which is untidy and poorly kept, reflects the characters of Meg, Stanley, and Petey, though in different ways. Meg is scatterbrained, and the boarding house suffers for her lack of attention to it. She spends too much time prancing around in front of Stanley to notice that her home is in disrepair. In short, she is more interested in her delusion of the house than in the house itself. Stage productions and films of The Birthday Party further illuminate Meg's untidiness with scenes in a dirty but quaint living room and dilapidated kitchen. The house also reflects Stanley's moodiness and generally unkempt appearance. He lives in a state of disruption. Finally, Petey's general disinterest in his life is reflected by his disinterest in the house. He would rather glance at the paper. 3. Discuss Stanley's and Lulu's interaction in Act I. What does it show about Stanley? Lulu is interested in Stanley, but he is unwilling to consider any deeper relationships. He is too much committed to an anonymous life of lethargy. Lulu's questions bother Stanley, since they touch on the past he would like to forget. Further, he is bothered by her sexual interest in him. More than anything, she feels bad for him and treats him like a disgruntled child. When she leaves, Stanley washes his face, which suggests their sexual tension and the fact that he has little use for such sexuality. He needs to be alone, perhaps to stay hidden from his past, and perhaps because he is too depressed for anything else. 4. Stage directions are essential in a play. Discuss Binter's stage directions in relation to character development. After Meg gives Stanley his toy drum, he hangs it around his neck and parades around the table. Pinter uses this scene to develop Stanley's character, to reveal how he is both a conformist and a rebel. As he playfully taps a beat on the drum while circling the table and then begins to bang it, as if he were possessed, Pinter uses very specific stage directions so that the action of the play, which was once stagnant, suddenly explodes. This creates tension, drama and unease. So much of the play has been unspoken and tense, and now the violence is made manifest. The same thing happens with the stage directions at the end of Act the Second. By using very few stage directions and then using specific ones, Pinter makes sure that his dramatic moments serve as a payoff to the lingering tension of the play. 5. Pinter was influenced by the Surrealists. Provide one example of surrealism within the play. Surrealism needs the pretense of reality, which is then subverted. The play is full of such juxtapositions from its very opening. The interrogation scene in Act the Second is a particularly great example. While the setup is recognizable, they are interrogating a suspect, their language is nonsensical and somewhat irrelevant. What matters is the power dynamic, which is exaggerated and menacing because they do not rely on language to cement it. Goldberg and McCann here appear prophetic and haunting in their interrogation of poor Stanley, who is neither guilty nor innocent, and yet is both. The play's essence of surrealism lies in the chaos between that which is real and that which is imagined. 6. Describe Stanley's descent into madness. Stanley is a depressed character, rumpled and unkempt. He is nasty and rude to everyone except Petey, to whom he shows a begrudging respect. However, these behaviors mask a deep depression that Goldberg and McCann exacerbate to lead him into madness. They threaten his poorly constructed world. From the moment he hears that two men are coming, he grows less arrogant and more on edge. His conversation with McCann in Act the Second reveals that he has lost control of his life, and is now desperate. The interrogation scene, though it only obliquely mentions specific offences, drives him into guilt-fueled stupor that then explodes into full-on madness during the party itself. Rather than physically harming Stanley, Goldberg and McCann attack his delusions, and all he has left is silence. 7. There are several acts of submission within the play. Provide an example and discuss the motivation of the characters. The play is very much concerned with power struggles. One example is the interrogation scene in Act the Second. Goldberg and McCann must first convince Stanley to sit down, an act which proves difficult since he refuses to cooperate. Despite McCann's forceful attitude and Goldberg's sugar-coated words, Stanley will not sit until they corner him. Their intent is to reinforce the power dynamic, to make sure he knows that they have the upper hand. Although Stanley refuses to sit from fear that they will physically harm him, he is not relieved to be untouched when he sits. Instead, he is more harmed by accepting the power dynamic, since it leads him further down his slow descent to madness. 8. Pinter often used language as a buffer between silence and action in his plays. Describe a scene within the birthday party when language was used to create silence. Goldberg's speeches often silence another character's opinions or arguments. For instance, when he and McCann first arrive, Goldberg speaks at length about his Uncle Barney in an effort to calm McCann. Goldberg uses his stories to distract, educate, and perhaps annoy. His words are so closely cropped together that they engender silence, a void after he finishes speaking. His words are not confusing, but his strange use of them creates confusion. Language seems more a tool or a weapon in this way. 9. Elements of realism are markedly present within the play. How is realism used in the birthday party? The boarding house and its inhabitants define realism within Pinter's play. Meg is the simple-minded matron, her husband the inattentive owner, and Stanley their disgruntled guest. The domestic scene of the living room, table, and chairs creates a comparison to other popular English plays of the time period. Further, their relationships, a potential affair between matron and boarder, a pleasant but dual marriage relationship, a pretty young girl from the town, all seem recognizable. It is important that Pinter make these elements seem so realistic so that his subversion of them is more affecting. By stripping away the layers of realism, by revealing long-hidden truths and creating chaos, the sightless elements of the play soon take the foreground, leaving realism and any illusion of truth behind. 10. Are Petey and Meg happily married? Provide examples to support your argument. It can be argued that Petey and Meg are happy because they have obviously made a life together. They are used to each other's personalities, and have set a very strict routine wherein Meg prepares Petey's breakfast. They talk to one another in the morning, and then Petey goes off to work. Neither Petey nor Meg is openly affectionate toward one another, but neither are they rude or dismissive. Lastly, Petey shows his protectiveness when he lies to her about Stanley's whereabouts in Act the Third. However, this complacency bleeds into disinterest. Meg frequently forgets his day and even forgets he was not at the party. In fact, Meg clearly gets more validation from Stanley's cruelty than she does from Petey's pleasant kindness. Further, it seems plausible that he knows of her sexual attraction to Stanley, but ignores it. Ultimately, the question is whether happiness comes from unpleasant passions or from pleasant, comfortable apathy.